which is a step toward building a genuinely socialist society. A step toward. It's not. There's a long way to go before I would call it socialist. But again, there are things that we really should defend. And the literacy rate is at nearly 100%, it's 99%. You can't really get it.
And it was really low before. What was it in rural populations? It was like
I had it written down somewhere, but there's no
30 or 40 or something. Like, it was bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's a program that they've instituted again in conjunction with local councils, a program where people who haven't graduated high school are put through a 2-year crash course program to get them up to that level, and it's all free. Teachers are volunteer. The materials are provided for free: books, TVs, and VCRs with educational material, and they're paid a stipend, basically paid a wage to go back and finish high school. Because obviously, if you're working and you have a family and people depend on you and you depend on your job, you can't just quit your job because you want to go back and get your high school diploma. And the same thing is true of university students. Public education is free up to the university level in Venezuela, but not everybody can afford to go to school full time and not work. So you can apply for a scholarship and they pay you a monthly wage to go to university. There's a lot of I call them very progressive measures that they're introduced. Not necessarily revolutionary, but extremely progressive. I mean, the Constitution is one of the most progressive ever written. The degree to which they've been able to implement the guarantees enshrined in the Constitution, that's a different conversation, and a lot of that has to do with the opposition.
One thing she really I feel like emphasized was that it is a capital society, and you said they're working in a capital structure, but as I move towards socialism, is there resistance or change that's occurring in that respect?
In which respect?
As far as the capitalism goes.
Well, I mean, there's certainly, like I said, alternative power structures that are cropping up. There's a move towards greater, what they call economic democracy, which is worker-run enterprises and stuff like that. But again, they're still operating in a market economy. There's a real push by both the state and the grassroots movements to develop a socialist ethic and socialist culture. Again, given the context, it's a tall order. I think that before you could really say that Venezuela is on a path towards socialism proper, there have to be some serious structural changes that we haven't seen yet. But again, when you have a government that is fighting for its very existence, it's difficult to push any further at this point.
I was curious, she said that the land being owned was, I don't know, it was done privately, and I was wondering, I'm assuming that the richer people, which are the ones that are sort of against the government right now, if they're owning land where poorer people live, are they giving trouble to them? Has there been documented violence there?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of land reform is notoriously difficult. It has failed in nearly every place that they've tried it, for various reasons. Now, in terms of Venezuela, you have a relatively small rural population. It's a highly urbanized society. The people who do live in rural areas have been forming their own land committees, which are, again, separate from the state. And at the same time, the state's passed laws that guarantee every adult Venezuelan a piece of land if they want it. They're primarily doing this by taking state-owned land and distributing it to farmers as private property. So there's certainly something to be said about that. It's reformist. It's certainly not revolutionary. I mean, it's not socialist. But they're also breaking up large plantations. If a piece of land that's prime farming land, I don't know how they define that, it's just the law says prime farming land, that's more than 500 acres, that's not being used, then they'll break that up and distribute it to farmers. If it's non-prime farmland that's more than 5,000 acres, they'll break that up and distribute it. So it's a form of expropriation. The landowners are allowed to dispute that, but they usually don't win. So what happens is the peasants will come in and occupy the land, form a land committee, and then petition the government to expropriate the property. And oftentimes the landowners will hire thugs to beat people up, to assassinate people.
Well, from my understanding, there wasn't a whole lot of farming land compared to other countries because there's so much oil, and so I guess when the government is promising everybody land, are there like discriminations between classes or what? Like, because I'm sure not all of the land is prime. I'm sure some of it is like contaminated with oil if they are guaranteeing every adult. So is there like...
Right. I don't know that... I think that the spirit of that law was sort of geared towards people who are already living in rural areas. And I think the intent behind it was to break up these large plantations that are owned by absentee landlords and that are underutilized. But they also have made an effort to grant titles to people who live in the barrios, who have built their own homes, who have done so illegally on land that they're either occupying or that nobody's claiming ownership to. So they've been distributing deeds to these houses that people have built. And they say that the advantage to this is that a landlord can't just pop up out of nowhere and say, hey, I have this piece of paper, I own this land, I'm taking it. And people have been able to use the homes that they've built that they now officially own as collateral to receive loans, which they can use for whatever purpose. It's not, it's a very reformist approach, and it's often done like in conjunction with microcredit, which has become a pretty big state-sponsored thing.
To what extent, are the workers' councils and the communal councils collaborative, and does one sort of supersede the other, and so the power it holds?
They sort of have so far defined their own geographical limits, and they have started to collaborate between councils. I have numbers somewhere on that. Let's see if I can find it. Maybe not. Anyway, they've been trying to organize sort of larger communal councils that are comprised of elected representatives from the neighborhood councils. There are 200 as of right now. They call them socialist communes. And there are 200 of them that coordinate for on an ad hoc basis for projects that involve multiple geographic entities that are self-defined. So again, it's another way that this parallel power structure is starting to emerge. But that's a relatively new development.
Yeah. Is there a limit, do you think, to maybe I should reframe that. Where the communal councils and sort of the alternative forms of governing have grown, where is the traditional forms of government giving away that power? Where is it shrinking?
In terms of local municipal governments, the only real way that they're ceding any power is that they're not getting as much money from the state as they used to. But other than that, they're sort of coexisting in a weird sort of way. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I wish that I had more information on what the councils have been doing when they're collaborating with each other, but I just don't know.
You talked about earlier the like for example the council will be doing some work on like the water. I'll go to the municipal water company or whatever it is, and how how does that, like, you have the municipal government, how do, like, those organizations working together, like, how does that work out?
According to the law, if a council, if it's a recognized communal council, if they pass a resolution, then whatever entity that resolution is directed at, whether it be the local water company or the national government to build a clinic or the municipal government, they have to respond within 90 days.
Wow.
That's one way that they're able to enforce decisions. Now, what does respond mean? That's
Yeah.
But they are required to respond. And by and large, they have generally gotten what they want. Most of the stuff is you're just making sure that people have clean drinking water. Making sure that this half this barrio is not going to slide down the hill the next time it rains. Stuff like that. We'll make sure that keeps everything. So I had like an order that I was going to go and I just sort of scrapped it. You can do social audits, which is interesting. Any citizen or citizen group has the right to request an audit for any public institution or any public project. And not only request it, but they're allowed to actually take part in it. Which is, it's more participants already. And of course, that sort of helps to undermine the old system of patronage and clientelism that dominated Venezuelan politics before Chavez came to power. So there's also citizen assemblies, which are a little bit different. The communal councils are permanent bodies, governing bodies. The citizens assemblies are groups that, as long as you get 1% of the voting age population to constitute this, then it's official. And they're convened on like an issue by issue basis to tackle one specific problem or issue or concern. And again, like the other ones, they're required. Whoever they're directing their grievance to is required to respond within 90 days. For a citizens assembly as well.
So that would be like a localized issue, like, the oil industry is like polluting this creek that runs into this lake behind this neighborhood or something. I'm sorry.
I was curious, because I know like a lot of neighboring countries, like Brazil especially, they have like the biofuel thing going on. And I guess I'm curious, like since Venezuela is a big oil producer and a lot of land has been urbanized, like since they're importing a lot of their food, is there a lot of just selling their oil and then importing biofuel, or are they like behind as far as like the eco stuff goes?
Well, I do know that there's definitely a drive, a state-led initiative to not just export crude, but to actually refine oil and make petroleum products inside the country. And that's part of an effort to stimulate industrial growth, because industrial growth was really slow in Venezuela because of the oil industry. And because of that, there was a really small Venezuelan working class for a long time. And that's part of the reason that the population was so apathetic and not mobilized in any way during much of the 20th century. Because you had a situation where there was no industrial working class, and there's a system of patronage where the government would just basically buy political loyalty. And that started to collapse in the late 80s after 20 years of recession. And that was the beginning of Chavez. But as far as environmental concerns go, it's in the Constitution that the state has an obligation to protect biodiversity to protect ecological processes. It is in the Constitution, and they have, the councils have subcommittees that are focused on environmental issues. I wouldn't say that it's one of their primary concerns at this point, but it is in the Constitution, and it's any sort of development program that the state sponsors is going to have that perspective. It's required to be sustainable.
Okay.
And whether or not they're actually doing that in a way that you and I would call sustainable, I don't know.
Okay.
A lot of what is in the Constitution in particular is more aspirational than something that's a reality at this point. And it's, that's good and bad. People really do take the Constitution seriously, though. I got a chance in Colorado a couple years ago to talk to some people who spent 6 months in Venezuela just sort of going around and seeing what was going on. And they would say that it would not at all be uncommon to see an oil worker or a farmer on a tractor with a copy of the Constitution in their back pocket while they're working. And you can buy little tiny forms of it on every street corner and stuff. So it's really like an aspirational document for a lot of people.
I mean, I can't blame them. If I had that sort of stuff in my country's Constitution, I'd be pretty stoked about it too.
I mean, they definitely have some pretty progressive things written. I mean, for example, they recognize raising children as an economic activity that produces wealth for society. So mothers get a monthly stipend, like a wage.
That's cool.
If they're not working.
I guess I'm curious on a more personal level, because I've heard that like their healthcare is really good there compared to Obamacare, and like as far as like reproductive health and I guess like, because I know in Canada, like the government, if you happen to be trans, like they will pay for your full transition, like free of charge. And so I'm curious, because I know like it's a very Christian Catholic area, like is that part of healthcare good as well?
I do not know. I mean, I know that they are really committed to women's health, but as far as trans goes, I have absolutely no idea.
I mean, they sort of, as women's health progresses, like behind the scenes trans health is getting better. That's pretty much how it goes in whatever country. But yeah, I was like curious, like if abortion is legal and basic stuff like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting subject, because it's in the Constitution that it's the healthcare is a fundamental human right from conception to death.
Yeah.
And the way that that's worded, so women get prenatal care, guaranteed prenatal care, which is good, but the way that it's worded and the way that that's been interpreted makes it, from what I understand, kind of difficult to get an abortion.
Okay. Because, like, I know here the right, I don't know, has a lot of, restrictions and stuff with healthcare, but I was curious if the right and left transfers in that way, like, are the issues that we think of being conservative or Republican, like, is it totally different? Or, because they said that the Democratic side of things is Christian-based more than the right, but...
Yeah, I would imagine that the situation in terms of abortions is going to be different in Venezuela just because of the way that part of the world is culturally. I don't really know the details beyond that, but I have read that it's somewhat difficult to get an abortion. And I don't know whether or not that it's coming from the state or if that's just a cultural quirk.
That's surprising considering how urbanized it is.
I wonder if that socialist projects have been very contradictory when it comes to abortions. I know that abortion was banned in the Soviet Union in like 1928 because they said the conditions that lead to a woman needing an abortion have been absolved. And Cuba said similar things when they banned abortion. So I don't know. This isn't. You may not know. You probably don't know the answer to this. I wonder if there's similar rhetoric around that.
I don't know. I would be surprised if there was.
Do they have?
I'd be surprised if they would be so audacious as to suggest that
Yeah.
they eliminated the conditions that would cause a need for that.
Do they have doctor suicide? Like, do you know anything about that down there?
I don't know anything about that either. I mean, it's religiously, it's a predominantly Catholic country from what I understand. So
They frown upon it, yeah.
Probably not.
In my adoptive family, my uncle is married to a woman from Latin America, and her family is from Venezuela, but they're living in Puerto Rico, and mental health is a big issue with them, I guess. And they actually, from my understanding, when their experience living in Venezuela was that there wasn't the taboo around like mental health care and stuff like that around like that there is in some parts of America. Like it was like going to get like your like annual like doctor appointment checkup. Like it was just considered a normal part of health care. So if things are still the same, I think that they aren't really like that, which is cool.
Yeah, I do know that mental health care and drug rehabilitation is part of the state-sponsored healthcare system.
Yeah, like
people do utilize those services.
I mean, you can, I guess, go to jail if you have like multiple drug charges, but I know that basically it's been, you're not a criminal, you are someone with a health issue, and you need to be. So, yeah.
Do you know anything about, I don't know, but do you know anything about like, what are the drug policies there? I know a lot of Latin American countries have like been a lot more open about those sorts of things and have dealt with addiction differently because of that.
Yeah, all that I know for sure is that drug rehabilitation is viewed differently. As far as the criminality of drug use and drug production, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a priority for the state right now or for the movement, but it may be, at some point in the future that's something that they would address. I mean, I think there's certainly a trend. If you look at Uruguay, there's legalized marijuana. There's certainly a trend in that direction, globally, and with the Bolivarian government being one of the more progressive, it's something that would surprise me if they were to go that direction.
Yeah, I did a lot of studying on Latin America and like their drug laws compared to the northwestern part of the hemisphere, I guess, and in that part of South America, like I think like cocaine is a really big issue, like coming through Venezuela and those countries to like Brazil, I guess. And so as far as, I don't know, like cocaine is like a really, really, really big issue here, the way Cincinnati is having a heroin issue, I guess. And so that's like major, oh, that's so bad, like there's a lot of like talking about, how awful that is, but then I don't know that they've gotten to like legalization for like medicinal purposes of marijuana. I don't think they're that far along, but I do know that psilocybin is not illegal in any form, and I guess just because that doesn't really grow in that part of the world, but I know that like the more natural drugs, I guess, they don't have like the marijuana is bad like you hear on Nancy Grace every day here.
Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of South American countries are going to be looking to Uruguay to see how that experiment pans out. Because the primary argument behind, well, one of the three primary arguments behind legalization of marijuana in Uruguay was that they had this huge problem of people smoking, it's like a cocaine paste, I think it's called pastilla. And they would, people would go and they would buy weed from the same people who were selling this really serious hard drug, and they'd be tempted to try it and then become addicts. So part of the argument is that if we legalize marijuana and people go to the store and buy it, then they're not going to be exposed to these drug dealers who are selling these really terrible substances. It's a huge social problem.
I heard that that's like, the cocaine has to be ionized for it to be smoked, like if you were to make a crack rock, but the reason that it's such a more of a big issue than typical like crack, I guess, would be is because the way that they're processing it, because of the oil industry, it's a lot easier to get a hold of products that people in other parts of the world who are making crack have easy access to, and so don't have easy access to, and so they found cheaper ways to make a smokable cocaine product, and I guess there's not as much, because it's so easy to get, there's not as much regulation on some of the products that they're getting, and it's 6 times the damage of regular crack because of the low quality.
It'll be interesting to see the way that the Bolivarian government goes on that. Traditionally socialist countries are not progressive in that sense.
How does, to what extent do the communal councils have control over policing and things like that?
I don't know how much control they have, if any, over the municipal police forces, which tend to be controlled by the opposition. But they do have, a year after, the 1-year anniversary of the 2002 coup, Chavez instituted a program of self-defense units, which basically gives some sort of rudimentary military training to people who are involved in the movement, ostensibly to prepare for any sort of foreign military intervention, which I guess at that time was a little bit more realistic, although it may be more realistic now. So there's a degree of that. I don't know how much control they're able to exert over the official police, though. That's still solidly in the hands of the local governments, which may or may not be Chavismo.
Right.
So since it's the opposition that has a lot of control over the police, is it the police force that is doing the violence that's enacted through the opposition, or is it a privatized people for hire thugs and stuff like that are doing more of the violence?
I would imagine that it's sort of off the record.
Off the record police work?
Well, no, just off the record. There's
no way to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the opposition has every interest in people dying. They have every interest in protests turning violent, and the means that they use to make that happen they're going to use whatever means they need to. Because the more unstable the opposition can make the country, the better chance they have of succeeding in overthrowing the government. The reason that they're doing this, of course, is because they can't win elections. They've tried and they've tried and they've tried, and they cannot win elections. So this is their only recourse is to cause chaos.
Yeah. Oh, so I had a question about what she shared. She said, I'm sorry, I forget her name. Was it Sharon? Susan? Yeah. That about the wires that are invisible that go across the roads and the lower. And I was wondering, logistically, if you knew about that in particular. Aren't there cars and trucks on it? I guess that's just sort of a technical question that I was curious about.
I don't know, I wasn't here for that.
Yeah, what I've seen, and I've heard reports, and you were talking about these, sort of community or autonomous police forces, or, defense forces, but I had seen, video of opposition people in opposition, like actually fixing. It would be like 2 telephone poles, and they would string this wire like at opportune times when maybe like there's either community members just riding around on their motorcycle or their bike, or like
during rush hour for the lower class that would be all on that.
Right, and I think it's specifically targeted maybe towards some of the these neighborhood defense forces, because like the opposition has characterized these defense forces as being like, you know, just malicious and just outwardly violent and just shooting opposition members in the streets. And like, so basically I guess if they can exert influence over the police forces, and they can influence them politically, and that, you know, ultimately the story in the media is going to be like state police forces shoot protesters, when it's like the right that's actually influencing them politically, and that's very dangerous. So like basically any instance of violence is going to be turned back around against the government, and it's going to disparage the supporters of the government, which is like really dangerous. And that's what we see, like the situation in the U.S. media is just being compared to Ukraine, and it's just like they could not be any more like empirically different, you know. I mean, it's miserable. So I think that's the most dangerous thing that we've seen, like in the media at least. Like,
I think it's only America really that is saying, oh yeah, what's going on with Venezuela and Ukraine are basically the same thing, because pretty much any other not third world country
those people
has like way better than any sort of America's news stations. Like what am I trying to say? Like the other countries, most other countries are very good at talking about important world topics, as opposed to like in America, where even though we're, you know, a pretty major country, there's not really. So I guess, yeah, like the rest of the world, I don't think is comparing them as much as we are, because most people aren't very informed. You really can't get any actual information at all unless you're listening to NPR, then it depends on what show on NPR. Some of them, it's not, there's been incorrect facts, or if you're watching or listening to the BBC, it's really frustrating. I don't know, like I was super excited that there was some information I could get about this topic, because I honestly didn't know where to look for like more than just a baseline of what's going on.
Back when Chavez was alive, he used to do a weekly call-in show.
Oh, like the fireside chats?
Yeah, except it would be like he would answer every question in great detail, and it would go anywhere from like 2 hours to like 7 hours long, depending on how many people were calling in and who he wanted to interview and stuff.
Didn't he one time like call the army to go to the Colombian border, and he deployed troops to the Colombian border live on TV one time. Just it was totally impromptu, apparently. I don't know.
I remember your troop deployment. I didn't know that he did it on live television.
Yeah.
It was just like, I don't know, bright idea.
That's pretty great.
She talked about that because the police are pretty much owned by the opposition. There's been a lot of experiments happening in community policing and peacekeeping and stuff like that. Do you know much more
that
about
that would have to do with those self-defense units, and that would primarily be organized through the communal councils. Yeah. That was probably a subcommittee of every communal council in the country.
Is it more like a neighborhood watch program, or is it more like a police force?
Halfway between, maybe. A little bit more active than a neighborhood watch, but not an official police force in any sense.
I was curious because it seems like a lot of the government that is still intact and like the Constitution and stuff is really progressive in a lot of senses. If the people who were supporting the socialist push, like, I guess like weapons control, like, is it, I don't know, like Canada, or is it really bad, like America, like as far as able to get it? And
There's a lot of gun violence.
okay.
There is.
Firearms are legal? To like completely legal or what?
Or is it like a?
They're certainly widespread enough. I don't know about the legality.
Mhm.
I'm sure it varies by state and by city.
Would that be something that the community councils would have control over in their area?
No, I think that would fall to the official municipal governments.
Right.
Do you think that the weapons are like? Because I know that pretty much there's hardly any part of South America that is left that doesn't have major cartel issues. And I guess I'm curious, like, since I'm, like, cartels probably aren't welcome by the left, like, is the, are the guns that they're getting, like, coming through with the drugs from cartels, or is it, like, going to a store, like, separate?
I don't know if anybody else knows anything about this, but I haven't come across anything about there being major cartel activity.
Oh, really?
At all.
That's good.
There's certainly a lot of crime, but it's more small scale crime, kidnappings and extortion, that sort of thing. But as far as organized crime is concerned, I haven't come across anything that would suggest that it's a major problem.
Okay. I guess when I was still going to high school, our Spanish teacher was from Venezuela and had moved here in the 90s because of, like, she was seeing preteens that were her kids' ages, like holding AK-47 on the side of the road.
Well, whenever you have high poverty levels, there's going to be
Okay.
a degree of crime, violence, and the poverty levels in Venezuela between 1980 and 1999 really, really skyrocketed. There was, I have the numbers somewhere, but it was extremely high when Chavez got into office, and it's gone down, but it's still an issue. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the economy is so dependent on oil that when there's a drop in oil prices or any kind of economic recession, it's going to hit really hard and really quickly. I think I've
I
covered
have a
most of
question. Sorry, my English is not very good. I know coming in the beginning, she talked to a little bit about the workers' situation over there, or I hear a little bit or not.
Did she touch on? I don't think
Not
working
really,
conditions
no.
specific. Now that I think
No.
about it, yeah.
Well, it is guaranteed in the Constitution that every worker has the right to a salary, a job and a salary that offers them dignity and provides for their and their families' basic needs. And not just basic material needs, but social needs, cultural needs. So that is guaranteed in the Constitution. So what they're trying to do is they're working towards full employment, but they don't necessarily have the resources to make that a reality at this point. But it is part of the Constitution, and workers certainly have a great deal more power in Venezuelan society than say here. And a lot of that is a lot of those initiatives are being led by workers themselves. And there are a lot of industries where either factories are completely owned and run by workers in the form of cooperatives, or there's joint control, where a workers' council and management will jointly operate a factory and both have the same degree of power, so that management is not in a position to coerce workers to do anything. So the situation is good, and it's getting better primarily because the workers themselves are learning how to organize and becoming better and better at what they're doing this time goes on.
The workers' councils, do they essentially work like unions, or if not, are they different?
They're a little different from a union in that unions exist to collectively bargain on behalf of the workers, whereas workers' councils exist so that workers actively participate in planning, organizing, and producing things in their factories. It's much more active. It's much more involved. They have more power. Workers' councils are pretty awesome.
Yeah.
When they're done right.
Yeah.
And are they noticing, like, I don't know, like I've heard where, like with cooperative businesses, you know, there's more pride in the quality of product they're producing. Is it similar?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it. I do know that with some of the larger industries, the big national industries like oil and electricity and stuff, those are jointly managed by workers' councils and management that works for the state. And the reason behind that is, according to the state, is the fact that what these companies do transcend the interests of just the workers in the company. There's national importance to things like oil and electricity, so there has to be a representative of the common good in the managing of those workplaces. So that's where the state representatives come in. So the big ones are jointly managed because they're afraid that there'll be a tendency for big companies that are worker-run, completely worker-run, to only act in the interests of those companies. I mean, it'll still be workers' control, but not necessarily for the common good. That's the state's argument. I don't know whether or not there's any truth to that in terms of like real-world examples, but that's their justification for the big companies not being completely worker-run, at least it's. So I pretty much covered everything that I wanted to touch on. I mean, if anybody else wants to say anything.
No, nothing.
No, I mean, thanks for coming.
Definitely.
This is really great and inspiring. Yeah, and again, thanks to Susan. She really outlined the situation. I think we were able to have like a deeper discussion about things. It's one that's not that in discussion. It's cool. Projector, but yeah, thank you again.
I'm not happy about this. I'm gonna have to watch it.
Yeah, it's saved on the site, fortunately. So.
Most of it should be. I think there was like 5 minutes there that got lost, but
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
That'll
Yeah.
happen.
What software did you use for the streaming?
I'm using the live stream application.
Oh, like on your phone?
Yeah.
Okay.
So-
because my synagogue does live streaming of their like every Friday evening, and
I've heard it's
like,
pretty popular for religious services and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've like they've had me help with that, so I didn't know like
Yeah.
if I could be of help if we wanted to do that kind of thing.